The Broken Wheel Saloon in Coal Creek didn't just smell bad. It smelled like the inside of a boot that had been worn for a week straight in a coal mine. It was a suffocating cocktail of stale beer, wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, sulphurous tang of black damp that clung to every man who walked through the swinging doors. Clara Maeve stood just inside the threshold, her head bowed so low her chin touched her chest. She tried to make herself small, to disappear into the shadows, but it was impossible. Clara took up space. She was a woman of substance in a town of starving skeletons. Her hips were wide, her arms thick and soft, her bosom ample enough to strain the seams of her faded gray wool dress. In a place where hunger hollowed out cheeks and turned ribs into ladders, Clara's size was an affront, a sin, a sign of gluttony she had never committed. She ate scraps, worked from dawn till dusk, yet her body stubbornly held on to every ounce. Her father, Tobias, gripped her arm with a hand that shook from withdrawal. His fingers dug painfully into her flesh. "Hold your head up, girl," Tobias hissed, his breath reeking of rot-gut whiskey. "Don't make me look bad. I got a thirst that's killing me." He dragged her toward the bar. The floorboards were slick with sawdust and spilled ale. Men turned on their stools, their eyes glazed and cruel. The piano player stopped mid-song, sensing the shift in the air. "Well, well," called out Silas, the barkeep, wiping a dirty rag across the scarred wood of the counter. "If it ain't Toby the Soak, coming to beg for another tab, you're dry, old man, dry as a bone." "Not begging, Silas," Tobias said, his voice trembling with a desperate, frantic energy. He shoved Clara forward so hard she stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the bar. The wood groaned under her weight. Laughter rippled through the room. It was a jagged, ugly sound. "Look at the size of her," a miner shouted from the back. "Careful, darling. Don't lean too hard or you'll tip the whole joint over." Clara squeezed her eyes shut. She focused on the grain of the wood under her fingers. "I am stone," she told herself. "I am a mountain. Mountains don't feel," but the tears pricked hot behind her eyelids anyway. "She's a worker," Tobias shouted, trying to be heard over the jeers. "Strong back, can haul water all day, can cook a stew out of shoe leather. She's worth plenty." "She'd eat the stew before it hit the bowl," another man yelled, and the room erupted in guffaws. Silas leaned over the bar, sneering. "I don't need a worker, Toby. I need coin. And you ain't got 2 coppers to rub together." "I'll trade," Tobias pleaded, sweat beading on his forehead. He grabbed a handful of Clara's dress, bunching the fabric. Take her. She can scrub the floors. She can. Warm a bed. There's plenty of her to go around." The cruelty of the words hit Clara like a physical blow. Her own father was selling her, not for land, not for a dowry, not even to pay a debt. He was selling her for a drink. Silas looked Clara up and down with open disgust. "I got a floor scrubber, and as for a bed warmer, she'd likely crush the frame." More laughter. Tears finally leaked out, tracking hot paths through the coal dust on Clara's cheeks. "1 keg," Tobias bargained, his voice cracking. "Just 1 keg of the dark ale. That's all. She's yours. Do what you want with her. Sell her to the brothel in the city. Just give me the keg." Silas paused. He looked at the desperate drunk, then at the weeping, humiliated woman. A cruel smile twisted his lips. A keg of ale was cheap. A servant he didn't have to pay? That was a profit. 1 keg, Silas agreed. "But you haul it out yourself." "Done!" Tobias shrieked. He let go of Clara as if she were burning him and scrambled toward the stacked barrels behind the bar. Clara stood frozen. Sold for beer. She was worth less than a mule, less than a shovel. She was worth a barrel of foamy brown liquid. The door to the saloon banged open. It wasn't just opened. It was thrown wide with a force that rattled the bottles on the shelf. A gust of freezing wind and snow blew in, swirling the sawdust into little tornadoes. The laughter died instantly. Standing in the doorway was a nightmare. He had to duck to enter. He was a giant, draped in the skins of wolves and bears. His coat was covered in fresh snow that hadn't melted yet, a testament to the cold he carried with him. His face was hidden behind a beard, as black as a coal seam, matted and wild. A jagged white scar ran from his temple to his jaw, cutting through his eyebrow and pulling his lip into a permanent snarl. Elias Thorne, the Iron. The miners shrank back. They knew him. He lived above the timberline where the air was too thin for normal men. They said he had killed a panther with a knife. They said he guarded a vein of gold as thick as a man's thigh. He came to town only for salt and bullets, and he never spoke. He walked to the bar. His boots, heavy, iron-toed things, thudded against the floorboards like the footsteps of doom. He smelled of pine resin, cold wind, and old blood. He stopped next to Clara. He didn't look at her. He looked at Silas. Silas swallowed hard, his bravado vanishing. "And Mr. Thorne, we didn't expect you till spring." Elias didn't answer. He reached into his coat. Every man in the room tensed, expecting a gun. Instead, Elias pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He dropped it on the bar. Thud. It sounded heavy, but dense. "Whiskey," Elias rumbled. His voice was deep, scraping like rocks in a landslide. Silas scrambled to pour a glass. His hand shook so bad he spilled half of it. Elias ignored the drink. He turned his head slowly. He looked at Tobias, who was struggling to roll a heavy keg toward the door. He looked at the jeering miners. Then he looked at Clara. Clara held her breath. She waited for the insult. She waited for the giant to laugh at the fat girl who had just been traded for beer. Elias's eyes were gray, the color of a storm cloud. They swept over her. They didn't stop at her face. They took in her wide hips, her thick waist, the heavy curve of her bosom. But there was no disgust in his gaze. There was intensity, a dark, terrifying focus. He looked back at the pouch on the bar. He reached out a massive scarred hand and untied the leather string. He tipped it over. Gold dust spilled out. Not a pinch, a pile. Nuggets the size of walnuts tumbled onto the wood. It was a fortune. It was enough to buy the saloon, the hotel next door, and half the town. The room gasped. Tobias stopped rolling the keg, his eyes bulging. "Double," Elias said. The word hung in the air. Silas stared at the gold. "Double? For the whiskey?" Elias pointed a finger at Clara. "For her." Silence. Absolute, dead silence. You want the girl?" Silas stammered. "But Toby just sold her for a keg." "He sold a slave," Elias growled. "I am buying a wife." He swept his arm across the bar, knocking the whiskey glass to the floor where it shattered. He scooped the gold back into the pouch, cinched it tight, and slammed it down in front of Clara. Then he did something that made the breath leave Clara's lungs in a rush. The giant stepped back. He lowered his massive frame. One knee hit the sawdust floor with a heavy thud. He bowed his head. He knelt. Before her. Before the fat girl. Before the unwanted daughter. He took her hand. His hand swallowed hers completely. It was rough, calloused, and freezing cold, but his grip was gentle. He looked up at her from his kneeling position. His scar crinkled as his eyes narrowed, searching her face. "Come," he said. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. Clara stared at him. She looked at her father, who was now staring greedily at the gold pouch Elias had left on the bar. Tobias didn't even look at her. He had his beer. He didn't care who took her. She looked back at Elias. He was still kneeling, waiting, a king bowing to a pauper. Trembling, tears streaming down her face, Clara nodded. Elias stood up. He towered over her again. He didn't let go of her hand. He turned to the room, glaring at the miners with a look that promised death to anyone who spoke. "Mine," he rumbled. He led her to the door. He kicked it open. The wind hit them, biting and cruel, but as they stepped out into the snow, Elias shifted his grip. He pulled her against his side, tucking her under his massive arm, shielding her from the blast. Clara Maeve walked out of the saloon, leaving her father and his keg behind. She was walking into the storm with a monster, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't walking alone. The wind outside the Broken Wheel Saloon didn't just blow it bit. It had teeth, sharp and crystalline, gnawing at any exposed skin until it burned red and then turned a numb, waxen white. Clara gasped as the cold hit her, the moisture on her cheeks from her tears instantly freezing into a tight mask. Elias didn't stop. He didn't offer her a coat, but the one he wore looked large enough to shelter a family. He marched her through the knee-deep slush toward the hitching rail where a beast stood waiting. It wasn't a riding horse. It was a Belgian draft, a creature of immense power, with hooves the size of dinner plates and a coat like shaggy iron wool. It snorted, blowing plumes of steam into the night air that looked like dragon smoke. Clara stopped, her boots sinking into the mud. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her numbness. I can't," she whispered, her voice snatched away by the gale. "I'm too heavy. I'll break his back." Elias turned. He looked at the horse, then at her. He didn't speak. He stepped into the mud, closing the distance between them. He reached out, his massive hands gripping her waist through the thin wool of her dress. Clara flinched, bracing for the strain, the grunt of exertion, the inevitable curse that always followed when men tried to move her. Her father often complained that she was rooted to the floor like a stump. But Elias didn't grunt. He bent his knees slightly, and then, with a surge of power that felt hydraulic, he lifted her. Clara let out a sharp squeak of surprise. She was airborne. For a split second she was weightless, a sensation she hadn't felt since she was a small child. He hoisted her up as if she were a sack of grain, depositing her sideways onto the saddle blanket. The horse didn't even shift its weight. Elias swung himself up behind her in one fluid motion. The leather of the saddle creaked, a deep groan of protest, but it held. Suddenly, she was enveloped. Elias's chest pressed against her back, a solid wall of heat that shocked her shivering frame. His arms, thick as tree limbs in the heavy fur sleeves, came around her to grab the reins, effectively caging her in. He smelled of pine resin, wet wool, and the deep metallic scent of the mountain itself. "Hold the pommel," he rumbled, his voice vibrating through her shoulder blades. He kicked the horse into motion. They didn't head for the road that led out of town. They headed straight for the tree line, into the black maw of the forest, where the mountain rose like a tombstone against the starless sky. The ascent was a nightmare of silence and cold. The trail was barely a deer path, winding up steep switchbacks where a single slip meant a fall into the abyss. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, terrified of the drop, terrified of the man breathing steadily behind her. She tried to hold herself stiff, trying to keep her softness from pressing against him, ashamed of the way her body spilled over. But the cold was relentless. It seeped through her threadbare dress, turning her blood to slush. Involuntarily, her body sought the only source of heat. She leaned back. Elias didn't push her away. He shifted slightly, adjusting his grip on the reins, allowing her to settle against him. He was like a furnace. The bare fur was coarse against her cheek, but it broke the wind. Hours passed. The town lights faded into nothing. They were alone in the void. Finally, the horse crested a ridge. The wind howled louder here, unimpeded by trees. "Home," Elias grunted. Clara opened her eyes. Perched on a granite shelf that jutted out over 1,000-foot drop was a cabin. It was built of logs so dark and massive, they looked like they had been hewn from petrified wood. It had no porch, no welcoming lantern. It squatted low against the rock face, anchored by iron rods driven deep into the stone. It looked less like a house, and more like a bunker. Elias halted the horse. He slid off, the snow crunching loudly under his boots. He reached up and pulled Clara down. Her legs were numb, useless blocks of wood. She stumbled as she hit the ground, her knees buckling. Elias caught her. He didn't catch her gently. He caught her firmly, his hand gripping her elbow to keep her upright. "Inside," he commanded, pointing to the heavy oak door. He led the horse toward a lean-to dug into the side of the cliff. Clara staggered to the door. Her frozen fingers fumbled with the latch, a heavy iron ring that stuck to her skin. She threw her shoulder against the wood and fell inside. The darkness was absolute. The air inside was stale and freezing, smelling of cold ash and cured meat. Clara stood shivering, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. The door opened behind her, blocking out the wind. The heavy bar dropped into place with a thud that sounded like a prison sentence. A match flared. Elias lit a kerosene lantern hanging from a central beam. The yellow light washed over the room. It was a bachelor's den. Utilitarian. Grim. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. The floor was rough-hewn planking, stained with grease. Traps hung from the rafters' steel jaws that looked cruel in the flickering light. There was a table covered in skinning knives, a single chair, and a bed in the corner piled high with furs. Elias walked past her as if she weren't there. He knelt by the hearth, striking a flint to a pile of dry moss. Fire roared to life, hungry and bright. He stood up and turned to her. In the light, his scar looked deeper, a jagged canyon running down his face. He watched her shivering. "Warm yourself," he said. Clara moved toward the fire, her hands extended. The heat stung her frozen skin. She looked around the cabin. There was only one bed. "Mr. Thorne," she whispered, her voice raspy, I can sleep on the floor. I'm used to it. I have padding." She gestured vaguely to her hips, a self-deprecating habit she used to ward off insults. Elias frowned. The scar crinkled. He looked at the bed, then at the floor, then at her. "Bed is yours," he said flatly. "But where will you sleep?" He pointed a thumb toward a ladder leading to a dark loft space above the kitchen area. "Up." He turned away, walking to the larder. He pulled out a slab of smoked venison and tossed it on the table. He grabbed a bucket. "Water," he said. "Spring is frozen. Need to chip ice." He grabbed an axe and walked out the door again, leaving her alone. Clara stood in the silence. The rejection stung, even though she expected it. He bought a servant, she thought. Or maybe he bought a pet. He can't bear to look at me. She looked at the venison. It was rock hard. She looked around the kitchen area. It was a disaster. Not dirty exactly, but chaotic. A sack of flour sat open, a mousetrap near it. Dried apples hung in a string from the ceiling, coated in dust. A tin of lard was left uncovered. Clara took a deep breath. She was terrified. She was sold. She was trapped on a cliff with a scarred giant, but she was Clara Maeve, and she knew how to keep a house. It was the one thing she could control. She moved. She found a basin and scrubbed her hands with lye soap. She found a clean cloth and wiped down the table, clearing away the knives and the grit. She found the flour sack, good high-quality wheat flour, surprisingly. She poured the flour into a bowl. She found a jar of salt. She looked at the dried apples. "I will make him eat," she thought. "If I feed him, maybe he won't hurt me. Maybe he'll see I have value beyond the keg." She worked the dough. The rhythm soothed her. Push, fold, turn. Her soft, heavy arms moved with grace. She chopped the apples, rehydrating them in a pot of melting snow water on the stove. She found a tin of cinnamon, a luxury tucked behind a jar of nails. She made biscuits, large, fluffy ones using the lard. She made a pie, rolling the crust out with a glass bottle because she couldn't find a pin. The cabin began to change. The sharp, metallic smell of the mountain man's life was slowly replaced by the warm, sweet, yeasty scent of baking. The fire crackled. The heat rose. An hour later, the door latch lifted. Elias stomped in, carrying 2 buckets of ice chips. His beard was frosted white. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped. He stopped dead in the entryway. He sniffed the air. His nostrils flared. He looked at the table. Clara had set it. She had found 2 tin plates and wiped them clean. In the center of the table sat a pan of golden brown biscuits, steaming in the cold air. Next to it, the apple pie, bubbling with sugar and spice. Elias dropped the buckets. Ice clattered onto the floor. He stared at the food. He stared at it, as if it were a mirage. He hadn't seen a hot home-cooked meal in 5 years. He lived on jerky and hardtack. He looked at Clara. She was standing by the stove, twisting her apron in her hands, her face flushed from the heat. She looked terrified, waiting for him to yell at her for wasting his supplies. I found the apples," she stammered, "and the flour. I hope it's all right. I can pay you back for the sugar if—" Elias walked to the table. He moved slowly, like a wolf approaching a trap. He reached out a hand, the hand that had killed men, and touched a biscuit. It was soft, hot. He picked it up. He didn't sit. He shoved the whole thing into his mouth. He chewed. He closed his eyes. A low sound escaped his throat, a groan of pure, unadulterated pleasure. He opened his eyes. They were intense, burning with a sudden, ferocious light. He grabbed the chair, spun it around, and sat. He ate. He didn't speak. He ate 3 biscuits in rapid succession. He cut a massive slice of the pie and ate it with his hands, licking the syrup from his fingers. He ate like a starving man. He ate like he was trying to fill a hole inside him that was bigger than his stomach. When he was done, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked at Clara. She hadn't moved. "You cook," he stated. His voice was rougher than before. "Yes," Clara whispered. It's all I'm good at. My father said I was built for the kitchen because I take up too much room in the parlor." Elias stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. He walked over to her. Clara flinched, backing up until her hips hit the stove. Elias stopped inches from her. He loomed over her, blocking the light. He reached out. Clara squeezed her eyes shut. He took a strand of her hair, which had escaped her bun, and tucked it behind her ear. His fingers grazed her cheek rough, calloused sandpaper against her soft skin. "Father was a fool," Elias growled. He turned abruptly and walked to the ladder. He climbed up into the darkness of the loft without another word. Clara stood by the stove, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She touched her cheek where his hand had been. It burned. She looked at the empty plate. He had eaten everything she made. He hadn't hit her. He hadn't called her a sow. She blew out the lamp and climbed into the big bed. The furs smelled of smoke and pine. For the first time in 20 years, she lay in the dark and didn't feel like a waste of space. She felt useful. Outside, the wind screamed, burying the cabin in white, but inside the smell of cinnamon lingered, a fragile promise that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a prison after all. The truce between them lasted for 2 weeks. It was a silent, fragile thing, built on the rhythm of chores and the exchange of necessary words. Clara baked, Elias ate. She mended his torn shirts. He chopped extra wood for the stove. They moved around each other in the small cabin like 2 planets in orbit, close enough to feel the gravity but terrified of the collision. Then the winter truly arrived. It didn't come with a whisper. It came with a howl. The temperature plummeted so fast, the sap in the pine trees froze with loud pistol-shot cracks that echoed through the valley. Elias had gone out to check the perimeter. A pack of timber wolves had been circling the ridge for days, their tracks bold and close to the stable. Clara was kneading dough, always kneading, her hands finding comfort in the resistance when she heard it. The scream of the wind changed pitch. It went from a moan to a shriek, a widowmaker blizzard. The sky turned a bruised purple, then vanished into a wall of white. The door burst open. Elias stumbled in. He didn't stomp the snow off. He fell. He crashed onto the floorboards, a heavy, dead weight. A gust of wind blew snow halfway across the room before Clara could throw her weight against the door to slam it shut and drop the bar. "Elias," she ran to him. He was shivering, not just trembling, convulsing. His teeth chattered with a sound like dry bones rattling in a cup. His skin was gray, his lips blue. "Wolf," he rasped, his eyes rolling back in his head. "Trap," snapped. Clara saw the blood on his leg. It wasn't fresh. It was dark, seeping through his buckskin trousers. She grabbed her sewing shears and cut the fabric away. The smell hit her first. Rot, heat. A gash on his thigh, days old, festering an angry red, streaked with black lines of infection. He had hidden it. He had walked on it, worked on it, refusing to show weakness, until the poison had entered his blood. "You stubborn fool," Clara whispered, panic rising in her throat. "You dying, stubborn fool." She touched his forehead. He was burning up. His skin was dry and scorching, yet he was shaking as if he were naked in a drift. She dragged him to the hearth. It took everything she had, all her weight, all her strength to pull his massive frame across the floor. She built the fire up until the chimney roared like a freight train. She stripped his wet, freezing clothes off, leaving him in his long johns. She piled every fur in the cabin on top of him, the buffalo robe, the bear skin, the wool blankets. It wasn't enough. An hour passed. The fire was hot enough to scorch the wood floor, but Elias was still shaking. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. He was muttering now, lost in the fever dream. "Sarah," he moaned, thrashing under the furs. "Sarah, eat, please eat." Clara froze. Sarah, the ghost in the cabin, the reason for the silence. "Tooth in," Elias wept, tears leaking from his closed eyes. "Bones, all bones. The cold took her. I couldn't warm her. She broke." Clara looked at the dying giant. She looked at his hands, clenching and unclenching, grasping for something solid. She looked at the snow piling up against the window, sealing them in a tomb of ice. He was dying of cold from the inside out. The fire couldn't reach the ice in his blood. Clara looked down at her own body. The body her father had sold. The body the town had mocked. The layers of softness, the heavy breasts, the thick thighs, the stomach that rolled when she sat. She thought, "I am heat." She didn't hesitate. She didn't feel shame. She felt a fierce, terrifying purpose. Clara stripped. She took off her dress. She unlaced her corset, the cage she hated, and threw it into the corner. She peeled off her petticoats until she stood in her thin cotton chemise, her skin pale and abundant in the firelight. She walked to the pile of furs. She pulled them back. She climbed in. She lay down beside the shivering mountain man. She pressed her body against his. She pulled his freezing back against her chest. She wrapped her thick, soft arms around him. She tangled her legs with his, pulling his icy feet between her calves. She covered them both with a heavy bearskin, sealing them in a cocoon of darkness and musk. "Shh," she whispered into his ear. "I've got you. I'm here." Elias flinched at the contact. He groaned, trying to pull away. "No! Fire! Too hot!" "Not fire," Clara soothed, holding him tighter. "Just Clara, just warmth." She used her weight to pin him down, to stop the thrashing. She used her softness to cushion his hard, shaking bones. She let her body heat the immense, radiating warmth of her sighs seep into him. Sometime in the deep, dark hours of the night, the shaking stopped. Elias let out a long, shuddering breath. He turned in her arms. In his delirium, he sought the heat. He buried his face in the crook of her neck. His hand, heavy and hot, landed on her waist. He pulled her closer, molding his jagged, scarred body against her yielding softness. "Soft," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Not bones, life." He didn't let go. He slept. The fever broke with the dawn. Clara woke to a strange sensation. Someone was watching her. She stiffened. She was still wrapped around him. Her leg was thrown over his. Her arm was pillowed under his head. She looked down. Elias was awake. His eyes were clear. The gray storm clouds were gone, replaced by a look of profound, stunned wonder. He was looking at her arm, the soft, pale underside of her forearm where it rested against his beard. He moved his head slightly, rubbing his cheek against her skin. Clara gasped and tried to pull away, shame flooding her face. I'm sorry. You were freezing. The rigors. I didn't know how else." "Stay," Elias rasped. His hand moved. It slid from her waist to her stomach. Clara flinched. She tried to suck it in, to hide the roll of flesh. "Don't," she whispered, tears springing to her eyes. I know I'm disgusting. I take up too much room." Elias's grip tightened, not to hurt, but to hold. "Disgusting?" he repeated, the word sounding alien in his mouth. He pushed himself up on one elbow, wincing as his leg protested. He looked down at her. He looked at the curve of her hip under the thin sheet. He looked at the fullness of her breast pressed against his chest. "Sarah starved," he said, his voice cracking. "The winter of '82. We were trapped. She was small, delicate. The cold ate her. I held her, and I felt her ribs snap. I felt her turn to ice in my arms." He looked at Clara's stomach. He placed his large, scarred hand flat against it, spreading his fingers wide. "You are not disgusting, Clara," he whispered. "You are abundance. You are a fortress against the cold." He leaned down. Clara stopped breathing. Elias pressed his lips to her stomach. He kissed the soft flesh through the cotton chemise. He rested his forehead against her, closing his eyes, breathing in the scent of her flower, sweat, and life. "I bought you because I saw a survivor," he murmured against her skin. "I saw a woman who could hold the world up." Clara lay frozen, the tears falling freely now. For 20 years, she had been told she was too much, too heavy, a burden. And here was this terrifying man, this king of the high timber, bowing to her body as if it were an altar. She slowly reached out. She tangled her fingers in his thick black hair. She pulled his head closer. "I won't break," she whispered fiercely. "I am sturdy, Elias. I can hold you." Elias looked up, his eyes wet. "My anchor," he said. He pulled her down. Then burying his face in her neck, wrapping his massive arms around her, holding her not like a possession, but like a man clinging to a life raft in a stormy sea. Outside, the snow buried the world. Inside, the ice around Elias's heart finally melted. The mountain wept as the winter died. It was a slow, mournful shedding of the season, the silence of the high peaks replaced by the relentless drumming rhythm of meltwater. Icicles the size of spear shafts lost their grip on the eaves of the cabin, crashing into the slush with a sound of shattering glass. The air, once sterile and biting, now hung heavy and wet, smelling of rotted pine needles, wet fur, and the deep, loamy musk of mud. Clara stood over the cast-iron cauldron in the yard, her face flushed pink from the steam. She was rendering tallow for soap, stirring the bubbling caustic mixture with a paddle of ash wood. It was dangerous work. The lye water was hot enough to strip skin from bone, but her hands were steady. They were the hands of a woman who had learned that survival required handling fire without getting burned. Inside the cabin, Elias was mending a trap. He sat on the edge of the bed, his bad legs stretched out stiffly before him. The wound had closed, leaving a puckered violet crater on his thigh that ached with every shift in the barometric pressure. He moved slower now. The fluid, predatory grace of the winter was gone, replaced by a hitch in his step that made him growl with frustration every time he tried to haul wood. But when he looked at Clara through the open door, the growl softened. He watched the way she moved, solid, capable, the abundance he had worshipped in the dark. She was no longer the shrinking girl from the saloon. She wore her size like armor now. Then the dogs started barking. Not the wolves, the dogs, a pack of scrawny, yapping curs that belonged to the valley. Elias dropped the trap. The metal clanged against the floorboards. He grabbed his Winchester from the wall, levering around into the chamber with a sharp clack-clack. "Clara!" he shouted, lurching to his feet, ignoring the stab of pain in his thigh. "Inside, now!" Clara looked up, wiping a strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She heard it then, the sucking squelch of hooves in deep mud, the jingle of cheap tack, and the slur of voices raised in drunken bravado. She didn't run. She didn't drop the paddle. She stood by the boiling cauldron, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knew that voice. "Come on out, you great hairy bastard!" a voice shrieked, cracking on the high notes. "You stole my property. I'm here to collect." Tobias, The name was a shard of ice in Clara's gut. Her father. Elias limped onto the porch, the rifle tucked into his shoulder. He looked like a cornered grizzly, scarred, limping, and utterly lethal. 3 riders emerged from the tree line. They were a sorry sight. Tobias led them, riding a sway-backed mule that looked ready to collapse. He was flanked by 2 men Clara recognized from the saloon red, a miner with a face like a smashed tomato, and a man they called Snake, who carried a long-barreled revolver and a reputation for shooting men in the back. They were drunk. Not the happy kind of drunk, but the mean, desperate kind that comes when the liquor runs low and the debts run high. "Get off my land," Elias rumbled. His voice was low, but it carried over the sound of the rushing creek. "Your land?" Tobias spat, swaying in his saddle. "You bought a girl, not the mountain, Thorn, and you cheated me. That gold, it ran out. I drank it dry." "That sounds like a personal failure," Elias said, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Turn around." "I want her back," Tobias screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Clara, who stood frozen by the soap pot. "She's my flesh and blood. You took advantage of a grieving father. I have a buyer in the city who pays for weight. A freak show, Thorn. They pay by the pound. She's worth a fortune." The insult hit Clara like a whip. Freak show. By the pound. The old shame flared, hot and suffocating. She looked down at her body, the familiar enemy. But then she looked at Elias. Elias didn't look at her with shame. He looked at Tobias with a hatred so pure it terrified her. "She is not a pound of meat," Elias snarled, stepping off the porch, his bad leg buckling slightly in the mud. "She is my wife." "She's a sow," Red laughed, pulling a jug of moonshine from his saddlebag. "A prize pig. Let's load her up, Toby." Snake drew his revolver. "Drop the rifle, cripple," Snake hissed, aiming at Elias's chest, "or I put a window in your lung." Elias hesitated. He could shoot Snake, but Snake already had the hammer back. At this distance they would kill each other, and then Clara would be alone with Tobias and Red. "Drop it," Snake repeated. Elias slowly lowered the Winchester. He set it in the mud. He raised his hands, his chest heaving. "Good," Tobias cackled. He slid off his mule, stumbling in the slush. He pulled a length of rough hemp rope from his belt. "Get her, Red. Tie her hooves." Red dismounted, grinning. He started toward Clara. "Come here, piggy," Red taunted, opening his arms wide. "Daddy's got a new home for you." Clara backed up until her skirts brushed the heat of the fire under the cauldron. The lye water bubbled ominously, a thick gray soup of caustic death. "Don't touch me," Clara warned. Her voice shook, but her hands gripped the heavy wooden paddle until her knuckles turned white. "Feisty," Red laughed. He lunged. Elias roared. It wasn't a human sound. It was the sound of the mountain breaking. He didn't care about the gun. He didn't care about the leg. He launched himself at Snake. The gunshot echoed through the valley. A spray of splinters exploded from the porch post inches from Elias's head. Snake had missed, his aim ruined by the liquor. Elias hit him like a falling boulder. They went down in the mud, a tangle of limbs and fur. Elias pounded Snake's face with a fist like a sledgehammer, once, twice, the sound of bone cracking sickeningly loud. But Red turned from Clara. He saw his friend going down. He pulled a knife, a rusted skinning blade, and ran at Elias's exposed back. Clara screamed. Elias was struggling to rise, his bad leg failing him in the slick mud. He couldn't turn fast enough. Red raised the knife. Clara didn't think. She didn't weigh the options. She didn't look for a weapon. She looked at the cauldron. She grabbed the iron handle of the heavy pot. It was scorching hot, searing her palms instantly, but she didn't let go. She used her heaviness. She used the strength in her thick arms, the leverage of her wide hips. She heaved. She didn't just tip it. She threw the liquid. A wave of boiling lye water arched through the air. It hit Red square in the face. The scream that tore out of Red's throat was a sound that would haunt the valley for a generation. It was the sound of a soul being ripped from a body. He dropped the knife. He clawed at his face, which was steaming, the skin instantly blistering and peeling away under the chemical burn. He fell to his knees, thrashing in the mud, blind and shrieking. Tobias, who had been approaching with the rope, froze. He looked at Red writhing on the ground. He looked at Elias, who was rising from Snake's unconscious body, his face smeared with mud and blood. And he looked at Clara. She stood by the empty cauldron, her chest heaving. Her hands were red and blistering, but she didn't seem to feel it. She looked massive. She looked terrifying. She looked like a goddess of vengeance carved from the mountain itself. "Get out," Clara said. Her voice was low, devoid of fear. It was the voice of the bear's wife. Tobias whimpered. The greed evaporated, replaced by a primal terror. He scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet. "Clara, baby girl, I was just—" Elias took a step forward. He was limping badly, dragging his left leg, but his eyes were fixed on Tobias's throat. He reached down, and picked up the skinning knife Red had dropped. "Run," Elias whispered. It was the only invitation Tobias needed. He abandoned his mule. He abandoned his friends, Snake out cold in the mud, Red sobbing and clawing at the snow. He ran. He scrambled down the switchback trail, sliding on his belly, weeping like a child. Elias stood panting, the knife hanging loosely in his hand. He looked at the carnage in his yard. Then he turned to Clara. The adrenaline crashed. Clara looked at her hands. The palms were angry red, bubbling with second-degree burns where she had gripped the hot iron. The pain hit her all at once, a wave of white-hot agony that made her knees buckle. "Elias," she whimpered, swaying. Elias dropped the knife. He ignored the pain in his leg. He moved to her, catching her just as she slumped. "I've got you," he gasped, his voice ragged with panic. "I've got you, Clara." He looked at her hands. He saw what she had done. She had wielded fire for him. She had disfigured a man to save him. "Snow," he commanded, dragging her toward a clean drift near the porch. "Put them in the snow." He plunged her burning hands into the icy powder. Clara cried out, a sob tearing from her throat, but the cold bit into the burn, numbing the worst of the fire. Elias fell to his knees beside her in the slush. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her shoulder. He was shaking not from cold, but from the sheer terror of almost losing her. "You fought," he whispered into her dress. "You fought." "I am not a sow," Clara sobbed, leaning her weight against him. "I am not a freak." "No," Elias swore, pulling back to look at her face. He reached up with a trembling, muddy hand to wipe a tear from her cheek. "You are the iron. You are the fire. You are everything." Snake groaned in the mud behind them. Red's whimpers had turned into low, shock-induced moans. "We need to bind them," Elias said, his voice hardening back into the survivor. "And we need to tend your hands." "My hands are fine," Clara lied, though they throbbed in time with her heart. She looked at the man she had saved. She looked at the sanctuary she had defended. "Let them run," Clara said, looking down the trail where her father had vanished. "Let them tell the town. Let them tell everyone that the fat girl burns." Elias looked at her with a mixture of awe and fierce pride. He nodded slowly. "Let them run," he agreed. He helped her stand, taking her weight without complaint. Together, they turned their backs on the broken men in the mud and walked into the cabin. The door didn't need to be locked anymore. The true fortress wasn't the logs or the stone, it was the two people standing inside it. The silence that followed the violence was heavier than the snow that still clung to the north face of the mountain. It was a silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of the two people standing in the mud and the distant fading whimpers of the men Elias had dragged to the trailhead and sent tumbling down the switchbacks. Snake and Red were gone, broken, burned, and terrified. They would live, but they would carry the marks of the bear and his wife for the rest of their miserable lives. Tobias had vanished into the timber like a ghost, his greed finally outweighed by his cowardice. Elias limped back to the porch. He looked older than he had an hour ago. The adrenaline had washed out of him, leaving his face gray and his movements stiff. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at Clara. She was sitting on the rough-hewn bench, her hands resting in her lap, palms up. They were angry red, blistering in angry welts where the hot iron handle had seared her skin. She wasn't crying, but her jaw was set so hard a muscle jumped in her cheek. "Inside," Elias said softly. It wasn't a command this time. It was a plea. He helped her stand, his hand hovering near her waist, afraid to touch her anywhere else, lest he cause more pain. They walked into the cabin. The air inside was still warm, smelling of the soap she had been making, and the faint, lingering scent of the morning's baking. It felt like a different world, a sanctuary that had been violated, but still stood. Elias guided her to the chair by the table. He went to the cupboard where he kept his medicines, a collection of jars filled with pungent salves made from bear grease, beeswax, and crushed arnica. He brought a basin of cool water and a clean linen cloth. He knelt before her. For the second time in their lives, the giant was on his knees. The first time, in the saloon, it had been a desperate gamble, a show of dominance disguised as submission. This time, it was an act of penance. "This will sting," he whispered, dipping the cloth in the water. He touched her palms with infinite gentleness. Clara hissed, her fingers curling instinctively, but she didn't pull away. She watched his face. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his eyes dark with a guilt that looked like physical pain. "I'm sorry," Elias murmured, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry, Clara." "For what?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the throb in her hands. "For saving me from Red's knife? Or for saving me from my father?" "For bringing this to your door," Elias said, looking up. His eyes were wet. "I thought the mountain was high enough. I thought the snow would hide us, but the rot always climbs." He applied the salve. It was cool and thick, soothing the fire in her skin. He wrapped her hands in strips of soft white cotton, tying the knots with his teeth, and one hand to avoid jostling her. When he was finished, he didn't stand up. He stayed there, resting his forearms on her knees, looking at her bandaged hands as if they were holy relics. "You have gold," he said suddenly. Clara frowned. "Elias?" "The pouch," he continued, rushing the words out. "There is still half of it left buried under the floorboards. And the furs, the winter haul is worth another 500. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "You take it. Tomorrow. I will saddle the draft horse. I will ride you down to the junction past the town. You can catch the stagecoach to Denver or San Francisco, somewhere warm, somewhere with paved streets and police who actually do their job." Clara stared at him. The pain in her hand seemed to recede, replaced by a cold knot in her stomach. "You are sending me away?" "I am setting you free," Elias corrected, though the words sounded like they were tearing his throat out. "Look at your hands, Clara. Look at them. You are a baker. You are soft. You were made for dough and sweet things, and I have made you pick up fire." He stood up then, unable to bear the closeness. He paced the small room, his limp pronounced. "I am a violence magnet. It is in my blood. It is in my name. If you stay, they will come back, or others will come. Men like Snake. Men like your father. Next time, I might be too slow. Next time, the lie might spill on you." He stopped by the window, staring out at the darkening yard. "You proved you are strong today. Stronger than any man I know. But you shouldn't have to be. You should be safe. You should be cherished in a house with glass windows, not fighting for your life in the mud." Clara looked at his broad, scarred back. She listened to the silence of the cabin. She thought about the city he described, paved streets, polite society. She thought about how those paved streets would feel under her boots. She thought about how the polite society would look at her. The heavy woman, the sow. They might take her gold, yes. They might smile to her face, but they would never see her. They would never look at her stomach and call it abundance. They would never kneel before her and wash her wounds. "Elias," she said. He didn't turn. "Turn around," she commanded. He turned slowly. He looked defeated, a man who had won the fight but lost the war. Clara stood up. She winced as her hands throbbed, but she ignored it. She walked over to him. She didn't stop until the toes of her boots touched his. "My father sold me for a keg of beer," she said clearly. "He looked at me and saw a weight he wanted to be rid of. The town looked at me and saw a joke. She raised her bandaged hands and placed them gently on his chest, right over his heart. "You bought me," she continued. "You paid gold. You paid more than I was worth in 100 lifetimes." "No," Elias argued weakly. "You were worth more." "Hush," she silenced him. "You bought a wife. But today I earned my keep. I didn't throw that water because I was scared, Elias. I threw it because this is my home, and you are my husband." "It is not a safe home," Elias whispered. "Safety is a myth," Clara said. "I was safe in the kitchen in town, and I was miserable. I was safe in my father's house, and I was starving." She leaned in, pressing her forehead against his chest. "I am not safe here, but I am alive. For the first time, I am not just taking up space. I am holding the line." She looked up at him, her eyes fierce and dry. "You said I was an anchor. Well, anchors don't float away just because the water gets rough. I am heavy, remember? I stay put." Elias stared down at her. He saw the resolve in her face. He saw the fire that matched his own. He realized, with a jolt that shook him to his core, that he couldn't make her go. Even if he dragged her to the stagecoach, she would walk back up the mountain. She wasn't his prisoner. She wasn't his rescue case. She was his equal. "You won't go?" he asked, his voice trembling with a hope he dared not feel. "Try to move me," Clara challenged, a small, tired smile touching her lips. "I've had a lot of biscuits this winter." Elias let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He reached out and wrapped his arms around her, careful of her hands, pulling her into him with a desperation that crushed the breath from her lungs. "My wife," he breathed into her hair, "my fierce, stubborn, beautiful wife." "Your partner," Clara corrected, resting her head on his shoulder. "Now, help me with the buttons on my dress. My hands, they don't work so well right now." Elias pulled back. He looked at her bandaged hands, then at her eyes. He nodded solemnity. He undressed her with the reverence of a priest handling sacred vestments. He helped her into the nightgown. He helped her into the bed he had slept in beside her every night since the blizzard. He climbed in after her. He didn't pull away to his side. He gathered her against him, her back to his chest, his arm draped protectively over her waist, his hand resting on the soft curve of her stomach. "We will build a wall," Elias whispered into the darkness. "A stone wall, high." "And a garden," Clara added sleepily. "I want potatoes, and herbs. The soil is good here." "A garden," Elias agreed. "Whatever you want, Clara. Everything." 1 year later, the spring sun hit the granite shelf with a brilliance that made the mica and the rocks sparkle like diamonds. The snow was gone, retreated to the highest peaks, leaving the valley floor a lush, vibrant green. The cabin had changed. It was no longer just a dark bunker against the wind. A sturdy stone wall, waist-high and thick, encircled the yard, giving it the feel of a courtyard. Inside the wall, raised beds overflowed with green shoots, potatoes, turnips, and the bright purple flowers of chives. A new scent mingled with the pine resin and wood smoke. Lavender. It grew in pots by the door, a touch of softness in the hard landscape. Clara stood on the porch. She wore a dress of sturdy blue calico, the fabric straining slightly across her chest, but she wore it with the grace of a queen. Her hands were scarred faint, silvery spiderwebs across her palms, but they were strong. She was kneading dough in a large wooden bowl, her rhythm steady and sure. She looked down the trail. Elias was coming up from the tree line. He walked with a heavy pack of furs on his back, his limp still there but less pronounced. He wasn't alone. Trotting beside him was a dog, not a scrawny cur, but a massive wolf-gray beast that looked like it could take down an elk. It was one of the pups from the wild pack, half-tamed and fiercely loyal only to the two people on the ridge. Elias stopped at the gate. He looked up at the porch. He saw his wife. He saw the sun catching the stray hairs that escaped her bun. He saw the peace in her face. He opened the gate and walked up the path. He dropped the heavy pack on the porch with a thud that shook the boards. "Heavy haul?" Clara asked, smiling. "Heavy," Elias agreed. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Town is quiet. Silas asked if we had any more of that apple brandy you made last fall, offered double price." Clara laughed. "Tell him the price is triple, and he has to haul the keg himself." Elias grinned a true smile that transformed his scarred face, making him look 10 years younger. "I told him." He walked up the steps. He didn't stop until he was standing right in front of her. He reached out and took her flour-dusted hands in his. He turned them over, tracing the silver scars on her palms with his thumbs. He leaned down and kissed each palm, a ritual he performed every time he came home. "Hungry?" Clara asked, her voice softening. "Starving," Elias said, but he wasn't looking at the dough. He was looking at her. He placed his hand on her waist, pulling her close, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of lavender and yeast. "Home," he murmured against her skin. "Home," Clara echoed, resting her cheek on his head. The mountain rose behind them, silent and eternal. The town below continued its desperate, hungry churn. But up here, on the edge of the sky, the transaction was complete. The gold had been paid, the beer had been drunk, and the heavy daughter had become the anchor that held the world together. They were the king and queen of the high timber, and their reign was one of abundance.